My name is Ruud de Mooij. I'm an advisor in the IMS Fiscal Affairs Department. And with me today is Juan Toro, who is a Deputy Director in the IMS Fiscal Affairs Department. Juan is the father of the so-called medium-term revenue strategy, a concept that has been developed by the Platform for Collaboration on Tax in 2016. And I'm going to ask a few questions to Juan. So Juan, what is a medium-term revenue strategy?
Hello, Ruud. Thank you very much for such a kind introduction. The medium-term revenue strategy concept actually has been very enlightening and rewarding work we have been doing in the Platform for Collaboration on Tax, and thanks for the words about my contribution to this. When we start developing the concept, we thought about tax system reform, and the medium-term revenue strategy is a high-level roadmap for the tax system reform over the 4 to 6 years. The idea is medium-term, and also is being comprehensive, covering the policy, the administration, and the legal aspect. But as a plan, the medium-term revenue strategy somehow represents a government strategy based on mobilizing resources through an enhanced tax system to finance the nation's economic and social programs through quality revenue. And I will stress the word quality, because it's a tax system reform that will mobilize resources, reflect distributional considerations, and create appropriate incentive for economic and social development. Something important to have in mind, though, is that the MTRS starts from the formulation of this high-level roadmap, and we will discuss later that something that is important also is that the MTRS is as well a process. It's a process of sustained implementation over time. That's why the emphasis on the medium-term concept.
So why did the Platform for Collaboration on Tax come up with this new concept in 2016?
Yeah, the Platform for Collaboration on Tax was asked by G20 at that time that there is a need to revise the effort of the tax system reform in countries, how to make this effort more efficient, how to enhance the tax capacity in countries and make the effort more effective in mobilizing resources. And the Platform for Collaboration Partners analyze, study previous experience with tax system reform, and come up with this concept of the need to make a change in the approach. Not just usual type of tax system reform effort, instead having a more comprehensive approach of tax system, but also embedded the tax system reform in several other component elements that are fundamental enablers to be more successful and effective in tax system reform. That's why the Platform for Collaboration on Tax, in reporting to G20, come up with this concept of the medium-term revenue strategy approach.
So if a country is interested in this concept and wants to pursue a medium-term revenue strategy, what are the prerequisites for that? Can every country do this?
Interesting question, Ruud, because in our views, all countries need to have a revenue strategy. And most countries have some kind of effort in tax system reform. The issue is, are those efforts kind of a medium-term revenue strategy or not? Are countries prepared to go through the process of the medium-term strategy or not? And I would say that somehow most countries can do that. But of course, there is capacities that will be needed to go through the overall approach, and particularly the four interdependent components that we will describe very shortly now. For example, the medium-term revenue strategy approach consider this 4 components that start with the social contract in terms of making the linkages between the need to mobilize revenues to finance expenditure priority for development. So make the connection that revenue mobilization is not in isolation, it's not in a vacuum, it's for financing the development strategies of the countries. Then one of the components of this revenue strategy is the tax system. Countries could mobilize revenues from different approaches, including debts, for example, but the medium-term revenue strategy focuses on the tax system and the need to enhance the tax system capacity of mobilized revenues. And that's why the MTRS second component put the accent in the tax system reform in a comprehensive manner, considering the policy, the administration, and the legal aspect. The third component, which is very important, is to have government involvement in leading the process. The government needs to lead the process steadily in this social contracts, in making the connection between revenue mobilization and social spending and priority expending for development. But in the third component is particularly so for developing a so-called whole of government approach, because tax system reform effort is not just the business of the Ministry of Finance, of the Revenue Department. It's the whole government that has to be involved, because the tax system impacts the whole economy. Different line ministries are related to the expenditure side, but also on the revenue side. So in this regard, the whole of government approach is crucial. And the other very significant part of this third component is the commitment of the government to pursue the tax system reform over time, because tax system changes do not change overnight. On the contrary, required medium, sustained commitment and support from the government. So in this regard, having in place the sustained political support and commitment in very concrete manner is crucial. And the fourth component is the coordination of different stakeholders to support the government-led effort. Many countries, for example, receive support from TA providers or donor community that is prioritizing support of revenue mobilization. But sometimes this support is fragmented, is not coordinated. Some countries even is overlapping. In this situation, the MTRS 4 component calls for having a much more coordinated approach under the leadership of the tax system reform strategy that the government is leading. So in this regard, countries need to have and put in place those sort of prerequisite and approach to go about the tax system reform. All countries can do it, but certainly countries with track records of sustained commitment, better coordination of donors, better capacity to redesign tax system in their own countries and with their own capacity will be better off. But it's not that other countries cannot do it.
So if a country decides to pursue such a strategy, how does the process go in terms of, you mentioned formulation, implementation? How does that work? Yeah, it's very important to make that distinction, Ruud, on the formulation versus implementation. Because formulation should end up with this high-level reform plan of the tax system with the different components, the policy, administration, and legal aspect. And it has to be a plan that is well sustained, is comprehensive, but is also as much as possible evidence-based, good policy-based, good data, good analysis. And this effort of formulation requires some steps that needs to be undertaken.
First is to have a good understanding of what the MTRS approach is about. As I described before, these 4 interdependent components, it's very important to understand that the MTRS is implementing 4 interdependent components. It's not one single in isolation. It's not a single component of the tax system in isolation. It's comprehensive, it's holistic, and it's important to go through those 4 interdependent components and understand well those 4 interdependent components. The Platform for Collaboration on Tax has produced technical notes and concept notes, so there is plenty of material that countries could tap into for learning about that. The second step in the formulation is to have a very clear stock taking of what are the ongoing tax system reform efforts. Why this is important? Because MTRS built upon ongoing tax system reform. It's not like we start from zero. Always MTRS should start for what the country is doing. Most countries are doing tax system reform with different reach. Some very targeted, some very narrow, other more comprehensive, some just very short-term focus. So it's very important to have a good stock taking of what is the ongoing tax system reform. And third, to make what we call sort of an MTRS gap analysis, how the ongoing tax system reform contrasts with the MTRS approach through this 4 components. How much the tax system reform effort, for example, are connected with expenditure needs and expenditure for development, or is just tax systems that are thinking on the revenue part. How the government is committing multi-year sustained effort, how the government is organizing the whole of government approach in order to support the tax system reform. And also how the CD capacity development provided, OTA providers and donor community is supporting this effort. Is under a comprehensive approach, or is just bilateral type of discussion? So all of those differences that could be between the ongoing tax system reform effort and the MTRS needs to be addressed for finally formulating the MTRS and closing those gaps. But when the MTRS is formulated and the country has this high-level medium-term tax system reform plan, we need to go to the implementation phase. And the implementation phase, again, stressing that we are talking about multi-year implementation phase, will require that there is reforms that will be implemented in the short term, hopefully producing revenue impact in the short term as well. What we have seen in the experience is that probably easier to get revenue impact from policy type of aspect in the tax system reform instead of the administration aspect. But the administration contribution is very important as well, because one of the significant part of the administration contribution should come from improving taxpayer compliance, which ultimately also create a more fair tax system. One of the key aspects during the implementation phase is to set a very strong and robust governance and reform management arrangements. We have seen in some countries not only implementing MTRS, but in general implementing tax system reform. When there is a good governance of managing the reform, the effort typically falls apart, the plans are not followed, resources are not committed, and suddenly the impact is really not achieving what was intended. In the case of MTRS, it's very important because there is a linkages with the financing of the development agenda. So in this regard, having a strong and robust governance and reform management is very crucial for the success of the overall reform. It will need to be steady over the span of the tax system reform effort for 4 or 6 years. So in this regard, the implementation phase, this is quite crucial. And during a year, things could happen. So during implementation, there is also the need for eventually revisiting some of the reforms, the need to adjust some of the reform, new emerging trends, emerging issues, etc. We are faced, for example, now clearly a significant crisis. So any tax system reform has to adjust in the middle of this. So those phases are crucial, formulation and implementation.
So Juan, you mentioned the country has a lead role in all this. You also mentioned the PCT partners, other donors. So what is exactly the role of the country, the PCT partners, and the donors in all this process?
Yes, the country, we have stressed that the country has to be in the lead always. In the different stages. It's very important for the country and the government to be in the lead of creating this dialogue on the social contract, in the interaction with civil society organization and the citizenship in general, the parliament, different stakeholders, the private sector. So the government definitely is in the lead. There is a need to create country ownership on this. Partners of the country, PCT partner in particular, for example, the partner organization of the PCT, we are all engaged in tax system reform support in different type of activities, many times complementary type of support to countries. So, and other donors also bilateral donors or bilateral CA provider and are also doing something similar. A big role for the external support that the MTRS advocates is the need to provide that support in a coordinated manner. In this regard, the PCT has an advantage in the sense that we already are partnering in tax system reform effort, analysis, and study in the context of our platform for collaboration on tax partnership. So we supposed to somehow lead by example in supporting countries in a coordinated manner and also strengthening in countries the lead of the government and the ownership of the countries. So we should, as a PCT partner, we should also encourage other donors, other tier providers to also practice that approach, because this will help the country lead the process, but more important, having a single tax system reform in the countries and not multiple tax system reform depending on the relationship, bilateral relations they could establish. So there is a responsibility over there. And sometimes it's difficult, of course, because different donors and different tier providers has their own mandates, and they eventually would like to prioritize their own mandates. And this is when issues like, for example, sequencing start being difficult, because in a tax system reform, apart from having the plan, in the implementation phase, the sequencing is very important. As we mentioned before, in a 4 to 6 year time horizon, there is measure that needs to be implemented first. There is priority reform in revenue administration, for example, that has to be implemented first or other later. So that means that the different partners that are supporting different components of the tax system reform has to somehow subordinate their own priorities for the sound sequencing of a well thought and well formulated tax system reform. So in this regard, there is a big responsibility over there.
So what has been your experience so far with the MTRS, and what has been the progress overall?
Somehow the experience has been a bit mixed in the following sense. When we first put forward the concept of the MTRS in mid 2016, it was novel and and we start doing a lot of outreach and dissemination, and we have several discussion with countries and with the different donors and CD partners, and there was a lot of enthusiasm. We organized several events, PCT with some of our other partners organizations, and there was a lot of outreach in 2017, also beginning of 2018. And we start formulation support in 2018, and very good engagement with countries, and we support several countries in going through the formulation stage. Some countries even getting to a draft of the MTRS. Very few moving into implementation. Actually, one of the first countries moving into implementation was in late 2018. But then in 2020, we have COVID, and this impacted quite significantly the need of public finances. So something that was interesting, though, is that some of the countries we supported in formulation used the work that was done for formulating an MTRS to respond to the COVID-19 crisis in the following sense, that you may recall, Ruud, that the COVID-19 crisis impacted significantly the need to allocate resources to the health sectors and to respond to the COVID crisis, to the pandemic, but also then with some of the measures to contain the pandemic impacted economic development in the sense that they closed down, for example, reduced activity, economic activity, and consequently revenue. So country has to navigate in a situation where revenue was declining, and at the same time they need to spend more. So, and some countries use part of the measures that were discussed in the context of MTRS to also respond on the revenue side. For the recovery part that countries are start to be embarked, and now we are moving in that direction. The MTRS will be very significant as an approach to retake tax system reform and revenue mobilization, which is a critical imperative in the years ahead. Countries need tax capacity, to finance development, and the COVID has impacted development in terms of impacting revenues and in impacting also priority spending. But the medium-term revenue strategy offers the possibility of, again, organizing tax system reform effort with a view to have a more effective approach to mobilize more revenues with a more sound approach to tax system reform. So we are hoping that tax system reform and medium-term revenue strategy will start playing a very significant role in the years ahead.
Very interesting and indeed very important in the current situation with the revenue shortfalls and high expenditure needs. So Juan, let me thank you very much for sharing your views and your experiences.
Great pleasure, and I hope countries continue with the enthusiasm on MTRS when we first start disseminating this concept, because the MTRS could be a framework that will be extremely useful in the years ahead. Thank you very much, Ruud.